Welcome to the Business Trendsetter Podcast, where we talk about trends and how to use them to grow your business. My name is Manny Turan.
And I'm Adam Hartung.
We're Spark Partners. We are trendsetters. We look at what's happening in the world. We understand the world through the vision of trends. And, trends has to do with what the market's doing, right? The customers are the market. And the real backdrop against which the market is moving is growth. So today's topic is growth. But first of all, I want to congratulate Adam Hartung and myself for the 200th podcast episode. So there's some magic that happens with the algorithms and such once you cross 200 episodes. We've been doing this for a number of years now, consistently. Our podcasts are generally listened by hundreds and even thousands of people here. So it's exciting times for the podcast. So congratulations to us both, Adam.
Hi, right, Manny. Congratulations to you.
Yes.
When you first approached me with this, I was a blogger, writing blogs, writing columns for Forbes, and I was getting ready to stop writing those columns and basically because Forbes wasn't in a position to pay me anymore. Forbes was falling apart. And you said we're going to start doing podcasts. I'll never forget it because I thought, does anybody really listen to podcasts?
Yeah.
It was a niche of the media industry that I had not paid much attention to prior to meeting you. Now, of course, podcasts are everywhere, everywhere.
The fact that we've reached 200 episodes means that we're in the 1%.
Wow.
Most podcasts don't make it past, I think the average is like 7 episodes or 6. So
we definitely beat that, but
yes,
quite a bit.
So I'm interested in the magic that'll happen now that the algorithms will be taking our podcast to higher levels. And one thing about our podcast that's really powerful is that, not to sound super trite, but we change lives. The things that we talk about, if you apply it to your business, if you make the right leadership decisions and align your business to trends, if you focus on your customer, if you kind of put all of our teachings down into your business, you're going to actually succeed and grow. And that will help with the bottom line. It'll help with your not only yourself and your executive staff, but also your employees, your vendors, your customers. Everybody wins. So it's really exciting stuff we do here.
Yeah, I think it's important that people do well in life and do well in their business and do well with their investing. And if you listen to what we're telling people all the time, we're evaluating whether or not something is going to grow. And the old phrase, you never saved your way to prosperity. The other side of the coin is you got to grow, and if you want to be successful. And you can't just sit there and hope things will get better. You have to be affirmative about it. And there's so many opportunities for growth out there. And yet so many people fall back on old notions that they think will let them survive, which instead just gets them in a lot of trouble. They tend to think that being conservative with money is good and you don't have to worry about revenue growth. And we just keep pointing out again and again and again, that's not true.
Right. Exactly. And how many tombstones are out there of companies that fail to focus on revenue and focused on earnings, focused on savings, focused on the defend and extend mentality. Sears, Kmart, all the toy companies out there, Toys R Us, and we talked about Boeing that's on the ropes. We talked about Intel that's on the ropes, and there's a company that used to be a high flyer and is all over the world really, and that is Starbucks. So I know there's some interesting things that are happening with Starbucks under the umbrella of growth. So let's start there, Adam, in this exploration of growth.
Yeah. Well, reminding me about my blogging days and my Forbes column days, I wrote a column about Starbucks back in 2009. And at the time, the CEO wasn't the current CEO. So we had a sort of a founding CEO. He didn't really found the company, but the first CEO grew the company really, really fast and big. And then he left and he was replaced. And the new person who came in started looking around and said, what we do at Starbucks is we sell coffee in these stores. And he said, we could do a lot more than that. And they actually created a video production company that won an Academy Award for a movie called Aquila and the Bee. And they got into the music business. They were producing and selling music. They had a number of businesses, and they were growing and doing quite well with that. And I thought it was fascinating, and I thought it was great. Well, the CEO came back, and he fired his replacement. And it was one of those CEOs that couldn't stand it, had to come back. And they went right back into just opening more Starbucks stores. Well, the problem is that eventually there's going to be all the Starbucks stores you need, right? There was a comedian that did a routine 7 years ago in which he joked about that he walked out of a Starbucks and looked across the street, and on the other side of the street was another Starbucks. And he did this whole comedy routine about there being so many Starbucks that they'd come to dominate the streets of the town in which he lived. That was 7 years ago. And so what do we see happening? Well, Starbucks is now not doing so well. Okay. They've had 2 consecutive quarters of declining revenues. And as I put in the book in 2007, that's a growth stall.
Let's explore that. Why is that such an interesting metric of two consecutive quarters of growth decline? Why is that a magic? Why is that magic?
Well, the issue, of course, is that you have to think about the economy, the world economy, as a giant balloon. And it's composed of a lot of businesses. And each of those businesses are little balloons inside the big balloon. So if the big balloon's growing at 3% per year, which is the rate at which most countries grow, most GDPs grow, it's the rate the world economy grows, 3%. What it means is you got to grow your revenues at 3% to keep up, right? Or you're not, the money's being spent somewhere else. Something's growing more than 3% because you're not growing at 3%. But then actually, to be honest, you still have to grow at 6. Why? Well, because you got to get the 3% for the economy, real growth, and you got to get the 3% to cover inflation. So that's 6. So 6% revenue growth is just the bare minimum to try to say you're part of the economy. And that doesn't let you replace assets. You do have assets that are wearing out, your property, plant, equipment, desks, chairs, cars, things they wear out. Your computers become obsolete. They have to be replaced. Printers wear out, become obsolete. You have to add new technology. People leave and you have to replace them. That's training costs. So you have to have some revenue growth to replace your assets and to keep your intellectual capital up to stuff. So that takes 4 more points of revenue growth. So that's 9. And now you've got 3 for the economy, 3 for inflation, 4 for the 3 for the inflation, 4 for replacing your assets. And you have to give something to your investors unless you're a nonprofit. So you need another point of revenue growth to pay your investors something. So that gets you to 10%. You got to grow at 10% per year just to stay relevant, just to stay in the economy. So we were looking at that and we're trying to figure out, well, what is what's an indicator? How would you know that you were really in trouble? Because we were saying, what would be the sort of the leading edge of recognizing that your revenue was not where it needed to be? And we started to look at companies and said, well, when their revenue started to decline, what was their probability of coming back or returning? If you had a couple of bad quarters, could you come back? And just see how simple that sounds. If you have a couple of bad quarters, could you come back? And that was because most people thought they could. Well, actually, we went in and we poured through this data, and this was part of what Spark Partners was founded upon back at the turn of the century, 20 years ago. We were taking a look and saying, what does a couple of quarters of bad revenue growth, of negative revenue growth do to you? And we learned that actually was pretty deadly. That only 7% of companies that have back-to-back negative revenue growth quarters actually ever recover and ever achieve a sustainable rate of growth again. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's already well on the way to disaster after just 2 quarters of negative revenue growth. And you can measure that negative revenue growth 2 ways. You can say, what did I do in the 4th quarter versus the 3rd, and the 3rd quarter versus the 2nd? The second way, but you might have a seasonal business. For example, computers, your personal computers, personal technology always has a huge 4th quarter because there's a lot of gift giving. Retailers have a huge 4th quarter because there's all of the holiday spending. So then in those instances, rather than compare quarter to quarter, we look at a quarter versus a year ago. So how did this quarter do versus last year in the same quarter? Are we ahead versus a year ago, or are we behind? So what we discovered was that, in fact, like I said, in 93% of the cases, if you have 2 consecutive negative growth quarters, then the odds are you're never going to be relevant again, that you're already in deep trouble. And so we can go back now and, the stories we like to talk about that we'll bring to bear, Sears, Kodak, those guys from the old days that disappeared, what happened to them? Wonder Bread, Hostess Baking, that we see that it was the 2 consecutive quarters was the leading edge of starting to see that they were getting tripped up. And the reality is most people look at earnings, and they're looking at earnings all the time. And so by paying attention to earnings, they'll say, don't worry about the revenue growth being negative for a couple of quarters. Look how well earnings did. Well, the reality is that's easy. If you want to let your revenue slide, this is really easy to cut costs. I mean, you can come in and say, okay, look, we're going to give up on this business or that business, or we're not going to replace this asset or whatever. And you'll get a real quick bump to your earnings. Or you could go sell a piece of your business to somebody at very low book value.
And there's also a lot of financial machinations, right? You can play the games with switching your accounting and
all the time. And so, so the net of it is people, they'll ignore those 2 bad quarters of revenue, and they'll say, well, it was okay because earnings did really, really well. When we found out it's just the opposite. In fact, half of those companies that have 2 negative quarters don't even survive a decade, right? Don't even survive a decade. Now, when we look at this, it does vary a bit by industry. So, for example, in technology, 2 negative quarters is really scary. Because that tells you, and if you're in the computer type businesses, networking businesses, the tech companies, that tells you people are shifting, and people shift fast in those businesses. I mean, look at how Motorola created the mobile phone business, and then boom, they're gone, right? There's no Motorola. Research in Motion with the BlackBerry became the Crackberries. Boom, they're gone, right? Yeah. Look at how Blockbuster Video was leading in terms of renting us DVDs, and initially VHS tapes and then DVDs. And boom, it just disappeared like so fast whenever streaming services came along. So, actually, they were in deep trouble by Netflix with their direct mail business, right, where they mailed you the DVD to your house. That really is what sunk them. But when streaming hit, they were gone completely. So we see that these things happen much more quickly than people want to believe. People would like to think, I could have 3 or 4 bad quarters. It's okay. Don't worry about it. And especially if I've got good earnings. So 2 quarters is a big thing to worry about. If you have 2 negative quarters, you've got a high risk that you're going to lose relevancy and you're not going to be sustainable. And you just won't be here in 5 to 10 years. Very high probability of that. And so that's just happened to Starbucks. They've got to the point with so many stores that they don't need any more stores. And now people they're not hunting for Starbucks because there's one everywhere they go. And in fact, they're not buying as much from them as they used to. The average ticket price has gone down. And of course, Starbucks leadership is blaming it on Jerome Powell and Joe Biden. And they're blaming it on the government and inflation and everything they can think of to blame it on but themselves. And the reality is that they just made some mistakes and they didn't compete effectively.
Well, what's interesting, before you jump in the data here real quick, is just, we talk about the Wall Street side, right? We talk about the earnings reports and the revenue reports and all that. But I also look at the Main Street. And just here in Tucson, as an example, over the past, I will say 24 months, so 2 years, the amount of mom and pop kind of bespoke coffee shops has tripled. And the amount of Starbucks around has probably doubled. So for me to get coffee from where I live, I now have about 15 choices within a mile. And there's a Starbucks that just opened down the street, and there's another one that opened down the street, just beyond that. And that's all within the past 6 months. And so there's another one that's being built about another mile east of here. So you can see that they're trying to build, but is it too late?
Yeah, I haven't been in a Starbucks. Well, I've been in them, but I haven't purchased anything in a Starbucks for probably 7 or 8 years. To me, Starbucks is in a way like McDonald's. It's consistent, right? And I enjoy, if I'm going to buy a cup of coffee, I like to find the mom and pop shops because I like to find people that are trying something new and trying something different. If I'm going to pay for a coffee instead of making it myself, which is it's a huge price difference between making a cup of Java in your house and getting one there. Then I want to try something new and different. And then the second thing I've noticed is how Starbucks has really kind of moved out on that trend thing where I order a cup of coffee and I just say, hey, I like to get a latte. I say, give me a latte with low-fat milk. And they kind of look at me like I'm a numbie. Like, what do you mean? Because everybody comes in with these really long explanations of all the things they want, right? Including a lot of flavorings. And I've learned almost all those flavorings are just loaded with sugar. There was something I think called a Frappuccino that I read has something like 600 or 700 calories, something huge.
Minimum.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of calories in some of these drinks. And So what they did by pushing forward on that, I think it pleased the palate of a lot of folks. But hey, it's just, coffee itself is not healthy. Now you've gone and made it even less healthy, and you're kind of out there in terms of having developed a trend. But it's a trend that had a lot of fads built into it because you went from flavor to flavor to flavor, and now people are kind of less interested in it. So the volume in the USA is down 10% from where it was a year ago. Their volume,
wow. That's huge.
Down 10%. Prices are up 4%. That's not again, that's not a good sign. It's not a good sign when people are buying less and you're trying to keep your revenues good by raising prices. That, as you know, eventually you end up with a cup of coffee that's $100, right? Trying to maintain your revenue. And so this is that early indicator of what's happening, what typically goes wrong when people start to have revenue declines, as they say, I got to make it up. Well, let's raise price. Let's see if we can get that loyal customer to cough up just a bit more money. Now, the other thing is what they've done internationally. I travel internationally mostly these days for holiday. In the old days, I did a lot of business, but I'm still outside the U.S., every year, several times. And you see Starbucks in a lot of these places. But the reality is that in foreign countries, Starbucks isn't nearly as, what it is in the United States. And there's a lot more competition. So, for example, they were saying for a long time they were going to make good in China. Well, it turns out that China ended up with a big competitor called Luckin Coffee, like Luckin, Luckin. And in China, their volumes are down 6%. For Starbucks, volumes are down 6%, and their revenue is off 14% because they couldn't raise price. Wow. So while the volume went down, they're having to cut price to try to maintain volume. In 2018, Starbucks had about 3,200 stores in China, 3,200 stores in China. Luckin had 0 in 2018, so that's 6 years ago, right? Now, Starbucks has 7,300 stores. Luckin has 20,000.
Good grief.
So talking about competition, that's competition, right?
That's competition.
And you have to be very aware. I mean, so the people that are running Luckin, whoever they are, they sit there and said, hey, the balloon is growing, coffee's growing, people are going to drink more coffee. Historically, China was a tea drinking country. And so as they just jumped on that with both feet. Well, what Starbucks folks let it get away from them. Right? Instead of sitting back and realizing, hey, I've overinvested in the United States, I better make sure I get this Chinese market, they let it get away from them. Now it's gone to Luckin. And now they don't have another thing, right? They don't have a movie production company or a music production company or anything else that they're doing. You can sit there and look at Amazon and be kind of upset. Say, well, wait a minute, what is, Amazon TV and Amazon movie production, what does that have to do, or AWS, what does that have to do with retail? And it kind of doesn't. But what it does show is that Amazon is able to branch off into other opportunities to make revenue, to keep the company growing. And so that's one of the reasons that we like Amazon. We talk about them as a successful company, is they don't let themselves get locked in to thinking of their business in one way, one narrow way. They're able to keep their revenues in other markets growing, and they're coming out with new things that you can buy, right? So that we can, not depending on price rises to keep the revenue going up. But I think now I have not been a fan of Starbucks as an investment ever. A lot of people were very excited, again, when the CEO came back a decade ago. But I saw it a lot like when the guy took over Kmart and Sears. It was, driven by a very narrow view of the world. Right. They invested in just one thing. And, he drove, Fast Eddie Lampert drove Sears right into the ditch. And now I think the CEO that is doing the same. And he's left. They've got a new CEO now. The new CEO is going to live in San Diego and commute and work by Zoom, running the company. He's only been in the job for 2 quarters. The first 2 quarters haven't looked very good. And if the board and the investors, the big mouth investors, are talking about him about working on earnings, we could easily say that we've reached the peak in terms of Starbucks. And it should be an interesting. I couldn't recommend anybody invest in it.
Yeah, it should be an interesting case study to watch unfold. And that's kind of the beauty of what we do here is we look at these early things. I mean, not a lot of people are really considering, they see a Starbucks down the street coming up and they think they're doing fine. But, it has to do with trends, right? We always talk about trends and why it's important. Let's shift gears slightly and talk about another pair of companies that are also sort of on the ropes. And those are Walgreens and CVS. Of course, historically, they were straight up pharmacies. They try to go into the the sort of like convenience store plus mentality, and they were popping in, every corner as well. So let's talk about those two under the backdrop of growth.
So when Obamacare was created, we started to see a lot of changes in the whole health industry, right? And one of the things that got created through Obamacare was these pharmacy benefit managers, okay, PBMs. And Caremark, for example, is a PBM. And what they do is they sit in a world in which they say, okay, we're going to be the middleman, buying from Pfizer and Novo Nordisk and selling it to the retail guys. And the interesting thing is how they price, because they've said to the pharmaceutical companies, and this is what the head of Novo Nordisk said to the U.S. Senate recently in some hearings that were led by Bernie Sanders. He said that at Novo Nordisk, he said that the PBMs come in and want to set a very, very high price. They want the drugs to be priced at, say, $1,000. Then what they do is they're able to go to the retailers and they say, look, when we sell you the drug, we're going to give you a discount. And the more you buy, the bigger your discount. And then there's rebates involved. The more you buy, we'll give you a rebate. And they tell the Novo Nordisk of the world, same thing. Look, we want you to have a high price, but if we buy in huge volume, we want you to give us a rebate at the end of the day. So in doing that, it lets them control the pricing. So there's a handful. There's Aetna, there's United, there's Caremark. There's just a few of these. They control the pricing on the pharmaceuticals. And as a result, you got to have super high volumes or you can't stay in business. And if you, to those people that live in some of the smaller towns out there, you're seeing that the independent the pharmacies are all going away. I mean, when I was a boy, there was this thing called Rexall. That was where the RX logo first came from, was this Rexall drug. I don't think there is a Rexall anymore. They're kind of like the IGAs of the world, Independent Grocers Association. Those stores are gone too. So the independents can't make it. I mean, just flat out, they don't get a big enough rebates. Sometimes they're getting the drugs and then they're selling them to their customers, and the price that they sell them to the customer turns out to be less than what they get to keep. They in fact lose money on the sales. And so they're just disappearing right and left. And at the same time, it's putting a company like Walgreens and Rite Aid that don't have a PBM of their own, they're getting squeezed is what's happening to them. Now, this has not been something that happened in 1 year. Obamacare has been around for a while, right? These PBMs have been being created and growing in strength for a long time. So they could have seen this coming. They should have seen this coming. They should have seen this as a trend. And like Amazon, which got into the business but went after it with big volume, we hear that Walmart's looking now at getting into it again was a direct business. Now, Walmart's considering greatly expanding its pharmaceutical business and doing a direct delivery to your house. Like Amazon has trucks. They're talking about having trucks to go to your house, not using the post office or UPS to get the drugs to you. And the idea here is that, we're going to get to just that wonderful oligopoly that Michael Porter enjoyed so much in competitive strategy, where they think that getting down to 3 competitors means that you've got the right number. Kind of like airlines. So every time we get to 3, nobody enjoys it anymore. Right. And that's why we're probably going to end up here. But these guys didn't see it coming. And as a result, CVS is the retail stores are not well. They've done 3,000 layoffs last year and another 5,000 this year. Walgreens said that 25% of its stores are unprofitable. So, hey, folks, that means they're going to get
25%.
25%. That was their last announcement. They said they're definitely closing 1,200 stores and that 25% of all their stores are unprofitable. They didn't figure out what to do. I mean, maybe they should put a McDonald's in them or something. The Rite Aid has closed 5, emerged from bankruptcy this year, but it closed 500 more stores. They're already gone. I mean, they're not going to make it back. So it's really now to be in an Amazon, Walmart, and probably a CVS game is what's going to be left of this thing. And, there's nothing we can do about it. So if you haven't dumped your Walgreens stock yet, I don't know why you're holding on to it. Again, we're not licensed to give stock advice here, but, I don't know why anybody would hang on to any of that stock or why you would want to be an investor in Rite Aid. There's one that's coming on now that I think is still really worth paying attention to, because this is a kind of story that I think will be interesting over the next 2 years, and that's Tesla. So Tesla, of course, is the car company that we know. Right. It's also the boring company, which drills tunnels, and not talked about very often, but they build a tunnel that's underneath the Las Vegas Strip, for example. So anyway, they got that business. They also have Solar City, which puts solar panels on people's roofs and does solar shingles. And then there's the Tesla Powerwall business. And the Powerwall business is where you can put a big ass battery in your house or in your business to be a backup. So that, for example, where you live, Manny, it's a great way to, all that sunshine that comes down in the wonderful state of Arizona, you collect it up in your battery, and then you can use the battery overnight to keep your air conditioner running, right? So you can stay on the grid, but at the same time, you buy less electricity once you got the Powerwall. And so that's the whole of Tesla. Well, it's turned out that the car business part, it's not doing so well, right? Now, here's, again, Tesla announced earnings, and when they announced earnings, the stock went up 11%. The best day the stock has done in like a decade. Goes up really well because earnings were up 17%. Profits were up 17%. But what I think we ought to pay more attention to, again, are those sales. Now, sales are definitely not declining at Tesla. I don't want to give you that sense. They're not in any kind of a growth stall. But sales are up 6.6%. And they self-testify that most all of that is coming because they released the Cybertruck, and there were a lot of people that had down payments on the Cybertruck and were really eager to get that product. And the other part of the business that did better is the cheapest cars. And they've announced that, in fact, in 2025, they're going to bring out an even lower cost car than the M3 or the lowest prices they have now. So their revenues are growing at about 6%. But they're going after lower prices and again, the niche market of the Cybertruck to get there. The overall EV market is growing at 11%. So their growth rate is just about 60% of the market growth rate. That's not a good sign. That means you're losing share, right? And in the United States, we don't have Chinese EVs. So it's in the United States, they're losing share to BMW and Ford and all the other manufacturers, right? Now, on the one hand, you have investors out there screaming and yelling that nobody's making any money in EVs and they don't like what's happening at Ford. But what we do know is that the marketplace is shifting. People are buying more EVs. The market is headed in that direction. And if your growth rate is only half the growth rate of the market overall, that's worth paying attention to because that's an early indicator that you may be getting in trouble. So digging into that earnings announcement, because again, a lot of times when we see growth not doing as well as it should be, we'll see earnings doing well. And that's certainly what happened here. But the earnings itself, most all that profit came from the home storage business and charging revenues. Right.
Wow.
So home storage is an interesting business. I think that's probably going to grow. That's the Tesla Powerwall business, right? But they do have a couple of competitors. We'll see how much attention that gets. We know the CEO is busy right now in something for a political candidate, and spending an awful lot of time on what used to be called Twitter, which seems to be a dying business. It's now only considered to be worth 10% of what it was worth when he bought it. And so I'm not sure that Musk's head is in the game all that well. We talked earlier in the year about the fact that instead of putting that the charging system that Tesla had was the leader, and they had gotten a whole standard set for the United States that would be the Tesla standard, and then abruptly they walked away from that. They walked away from the charging business.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy. And again, why did their earnings go up? Well, okay, you have a bunch of Powerwalls out there. You have a bunch of charging stations out there. And now you don't have any of the costs of the charging station. You got rid of all the people that were in that charging business. Of course, your profits are going to go up, right? But you're not selling any more charging stations. You're not installing any more charging stations. And charging stations, as you know, get into disrepair. If you don't do proper maintenance on them, you don't take care of them. So there's a good chance that without attention, that these Tesla charging stations are going to start having problems. And then you're going to have people upset, and the revenues aren't going to grow. So the sales the sales of cars, low end and Cybertrucks. And how big is the Cybertruck business going to be? Well, we know that the F-150 Lightning, when Ford launched it, everybody was very excited about it. But then they discovered that the way you use a pickup, towing trailers, heavy loads, year-round usage, often in rural areas, sometimes where the weather's very, very hot or very, very cold. We learned that battery life wasn't really what you wanted to have for that, right? Because now if you're towing a trailer, your battery is only going to last 30% or 40% of the mileage that it lasted before. And so they've had the people with F-150 Lightning, people have turned them back in saying, look, they're not really practical for heavy duty use as a contractor or, if as a farmer in a rural environment. So the Cybertruck that's not the market they're going for. It doesn't have an open rear end. If you've looked at it, that the rear end is covered. It's really, kind of a suburbanite's pickup.
So it's an urban truck.
Yeah, sure. Exactly. Now, that's great, and they'll probably sell a lot of them, and a lot of folks think they look really good and stylish and modernistic, so that's fine. But is it going to replace the F-150? I kind of doubt it, right? I kind of doubt it. And there's a lot more work that's going to have to be done. So what can we expect in terms of growth of the Cybertruck at its price point? Will that be able to carry the load? And what's going to replace the charging revenue if it starts to decline because they're not doing proper maintenance and taking care of the standards out there? And the third thing is carbon credits. Because they are the largest manufacturer of EV cars, they get a lot of carbon credits, and they can turn around and sell those to General Motors and Ford and other participants in the market so that they can meet the carbon standards that are set by the EPA. Well, as those guys get more and more EVs out there, then you're not going to have as many they're not going to be willing to pay as much for the carbon credits. So when your profitability is depending upon charging stations that you've said you're walking away from that business, home storage, okay, they're going to stay in that one. We'll see how it grows. And then carbon credits and the Cybertruck, and revenues are only growing half the rate of the marketplace in the EV business. That's when we start saying they better pay attention. And the CEO and the leadership team and the investors, I think the investors probably got a little overly excited at this earnings announcement because the revenue side of this equation doesn't look nearly as exciting.
Yeah, that's a lot of really good information. In the last couple minutes of our podcast today, Adam, let's talk about what we think is going to happen to Tesla. We'll say next quarter, 4 months from now.
Again, I think that their revenue...
we're not financial people. We're not going to tell you to buy or sell the stock. We're just talking about the trends based on the analysis that you just put forth. What should we look out for?
I think we should look out for revenues to not keep up with the market itself. I think that's the big thing. They need to get back to that 10% per year revenue growth, and they're not there. They're at 6.6%. And they're not at 10. We want that 10. That's the magic number. Don't ever forget that. If you start sliding below that, that's when you risk getting into a situation where you could have a negative revenue growth, a year-over-year down quarter. If they hit a year-over-year down quarter, I would be very, very worried about Tesla's future, right? Because some tech companies can come back. I mean, it's easier to launch a new technology product, a new iPhone, something like that. That's far easier to do than bringing out a car. Now, look at how long it took them to bring the Model 3 out. Look how long it took them to get the Cybertruck out. It took three times as long on the Cybertruck as Musk projected it would take. So if they fall into a negative revenue situation, then I'd be very worried about it. I think that right now the prognosis I have for them is their eyes aren't on the ball. There's not enough attention. They're totally committed to going with the self-driving cars and then having a robo-taxi. And if you saw Musk on television recently where he did the big event, he demonstrated a self-driving car, which wasn't self-driving. Somebody was sitting behind the curtain driving that car that he got in, by the way. It did not drive itself. But he demonstrated a car that had no steering wheel, right? And said, this is the future, no steering wheel. And we're going to have an Uber-like app, and you'll be able to get around on it. And I look at that and I think, that is the future. Is that the future in 2025? I don't think so, right?
Yeah.
We already have problems with Waymo cars in California. We're still trying to get through really understanding this technology and making sure that it works and making sure that it's effective and not killing people. And we found some real serious bugs have come out. That doesn't mean that I'm not a believer. I am a believer in autonomous vehicles. It is going to happen. But if it doesn't, if you're betting all the company on it to happen by 2025, the odds are is you're probably going to get tripped up, and it's going to take a little longer than that for it to get out to the marketplace, and that means your competition could catch up. Because if you don't get your revenues and you don't get your share of the profits, then you're not going to stay in that leadership position, and you're going to start to fall behind. And that's the big concern I have for Tesla.
That's very good analysis, Adam. And with that, we'll conclude today's podcast, number 200 on our roster list. And I think for next podcast, there's lots of discussion around BRICS and what's happening with that, and the the countries that are joined today and that want to join, and some of the currency things. So we'll do a full breakdown of BRICS next podcast. And with that, Adam, we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Manny.
Cheers.